Hello. Today I'm going to talk to you about David Copperfield. Um, Very famous book by Charles Dickens, most notably because it is believed to be the most autobiographical of Dickens's work. And of course, you've got the title David Copperfield. If you turn the initials around from DC to CD, you get Charles Dickens. So the connection is obvious. He wrote this book between 1849 and 1850. That's when it was published anyway, writing on the go, of course. Before that, he'd just written Dombey and Son, which is quite a bleak book with a really long period of a child dying, presumably something horrific like cancer, and scenes abroad and mysterious woman. It is quite dark and brooding. And then he sort of went to write some short stories, Christmas stories, etc. Took a year out, really. And then he wrote this book. And this is kind of a transition or turning point for Dickens. In a way, he feels very comfortable in his abilities. He's got plenty of strength, and he thinks now, this is what I'm suspecting anyway, that he feels capable to transmute the experience of his life to a novel. Don't think he ever really wanted to tell the whole tale, because probably his life isn't that flattering if it was put down starkly. Fictionalize his life, and he just does it brilliantly. He's just in complete control of this book. It's so well structured. The story holds together really well. All the characters are interconnected. In the ending, everything, all the loose ends are tied up. From a Victorian novel point of view, it's pretty much perfect. As you could see, it's pretty thick, but it's not as ambitious in its social scope as Dickens was going on to write after this. He obviously wrote Bleak House, and then Hard Times, a smaller book, but then Little Dorrit, and of course finally Our Mutual Friend, which are massive books with great ambition to capture Victorian society from the bottom to the top, from the able-bodied to the disabled. Magnificent creations, but this one is far more focused. It's what the Germans would call a Bildungsroman, which means that it's the story of one life. So like Henry Fielding, you take a young person or a child and you tell their story and how their character progresses and the realizations that they make in their life. And these are lessons that the reader can take away. And of course, because of this, it's written in the first person. So, history of Dickens doing this. This is the only novel really in the first person. In Bleak House, he has a very unusual narrative structure where you have Esther's narrative, which is in the first person, and then you have the third person narrative, and they take turns for chapters, quite experimental at the time. And then the only other thing I can think of is at the start of the old Curiosity Shop. He has the first few pages in the first person, but then he changes to the third person. I think that's just a sort of device to draw the reader in from installment to installment. Creating little excitement points throughout the installments is important. You've got to keep them, just like the box set of today. You've got to always include something exciting. So, what's this book about? Well, clearly, it's about the story of David Copperfield. For me, it's about relationships. And with relationships, you've got parenting and marriage and friendship being really key themes in this novel. And you've got a lot of it's sort of like distilled Dickens in a way. You've got many of his ideas are coming out that, recur throughout his writing that are very important to him as well, such as education, treatment of children. This one is quite strong also in, rights for married women, essentially. which I think is quite powerful. Yeah, so let's begin at the beginning. And that's funny because this is what Charles Dickens says. Whether I shall turn out to be the hero of my own life, or whether that station will be held by anybody else, these pages must show. To begin my life with the beginning of my life, I record that I was born, as I have been informed and believe, on a Friday at 12 o'clock at night. It was remarked that the clock began to strike, and I began to cry simultaneously. All right, so yes, sort of miserable from the moment of his birth. You can see it's quite a light-hearted tone. He's being witty to begin at the beginning of my life, and obviously can't be certain that when he was born, these were all kind of amusing things. And yes, it's carried on. The tone of it is, you can see he really enjoyed writing it, and probably reading it as well. And Dickens says that it was, his favourite work, his favourite child, as it was. And you can see why he's just enjoying the detail, especially in the first part of the book. There's a lot of... he's lingering to give us details about, his home and the garden and his life with his mother in the early part of his life, when things were not idyllic because his father's dead at the start of the book, but very enjoyable. This is before the fall, as it were, when he goes into hard times. And so, let's try and get this out of the way straight away. David Copperfield is a fictional character, and it's told through the first person. It isn't, of course, it's Charles Dickens writing it, but we mustn't mistake, all the feelings that David Copperfield has and all the things that happen to him for being the same for Charles Dickens. Clearly not. There are moments, which I shall point out to you, where it's clear that Dickens is ripping back the curtain, as it were, or tearing through the veil of this device, and he speaks quite clearly to the reader. He just can't help himself, really. But there's very little authorial comment like that. But there are moments, and there's had some very beautiful and emotional moments as well, when the writer is reflecting on his experience of writing this book, looking back from what he knows as an older man to seeing himself as a younger man. And there's a pathos in that that's clearly very much attached to Dickens as well. So, to go through the events, what are the similarities? Well, in the book, his father dies before he's born. That's not true. Instead, his father went to debtor's prison after working for the Navy. He got into debt and spent several years in the Marshalsea prison for debtors. So a quite wise decision on Dickens's part to change that, because the start of the book would have been like the start of Little Dorrit, in a sense, because he was to write that later. It would have distracted and also made the novel incredibly long if he could spend chapters and chapters dealing with his father's travails when he was only a kid. So he conveniently, as a novelist, decided to miss out that part of his life. I don't think his mother remarried, so the Murdstones are completely invented. But he was denied an education. He gets a bit of an education in David Copperfield, obviously, where he meets Steerforth, and that's a very important part of the story. But it's true that he was sent to work in a factory by his parents rather than the Murdstones. So that's a very powerful, informative point in his life, and he clearly includes this, and it allows him to talk about the disgraceful way that Victorian society treated children and protected children as well. And then then you've got the thing about he did get involved. I think he was a clerk for a law firm, and then you've got very similar thing happens when his aunt pays for him to join a company, Spenlow and Jorkins, to study to be part of Commons. to some sort of ecclesiastical laws to become a lawyer. And then in real life, of course, he did start to do parliamentary reporting, and this is what happens in the book. And then near the end of the book, it becomes very kind of close that a fictional character, David Copperfield, becomes a writer, and of course, so did Dickens. So this point where his career is starting to take off, that section is very close to his real life. And then, yes, he did marry very early while he was writing Oliver Twist, his second novel. So, and same for David Copperfield. The marriage didn't work out. It's a bit convenient. Well, I'm going to talk about this later. This is maybe the only sour note for the experience of somebody in the 21st century reading this book, that he didn't get along with his real wife. This is Charles Dickens, and separated. And in the book, conveniently, perhaps the first wife dies, so he doesn't take that blame on, as it were. And then, yes, he remarries in the book, and in real life, I think he just has an affair with a teenage actress, Ellen Turney. So that diverts at the end. All right, so that's a sort of summary of the connections and the divergences between David Copperfield's life and Charles Dickens' life. So let's talk about the relationship. There's so many interesting relationships that go on, and they're all kind of like they balance each other. They're foils for each other. They develop themes. So much of this book works through interesting relationships that really draw you in as a reader. You're fascinated by them because, of course, you've only got this partial view, so you haven't got Charles Dickens, the third-person authorial voice, guiding you in how you should feel about some of these characters. And indeed, we have, I would say, probably two characters that are quite ambiguous. You don't really know what to make of them. The first is Micawber, who's this. He can be played on the stage and movies. A wonderfully comic character. This bizarre, loquacious language, Latinate language that he loves showing off his learning and education. He's aspiring to be kind of like middle class or, a man of means and wealth, but he's completely poor. And in some ways, especially when although he holds out the hand of friendship and kindness to David Copperfield when he needed it most, when he was a child working in this factory, being paid starvation wages. The family took him in, and this is what the young child needed. It's very clear that he's just a bit of a con man, really. He's always having these ventures that don't succeed, but success is around the corner, and he just has to raise some money by basically borrowing. He writes notes. He litters the place with notes, and you see at the beginning the debtors are at the door when David Copperfield first arrives at the house. It does done very well in the movie on YouTube that I saw recently. Well, resaw recently. He just seems very irresponsible. He also borrows from some of the nice characters in the book, like Treadles, and you think, oh God, you're never going to get your money back. This bloke, he talks a good game, but he's a bit of a con man, really. However, what we find is near the end of the book, he's a man of he shows great emotions, and he values things, and he seems to be really sincere despite his pecuniary uselessness. And at the end of the novel, he feels that he can't betray his friends, and he has to reveal that Uriah Heep has been fraudulently stealing from Mr. Wickfield. I'll explain all of this later. And so he becomes forward as a plot device to bring the bad people to justice in the book. So, what looked like a pretty dodgy character to me turns out to be, a very important character, and the kingmaker, as it were, in making sure that the bad get their just rewards. And the other character is opposite. We first of all see Steerforth, who David Copperfield meets at school, as being a bit of a saviour, basically, for the young Copperfield, because he's bullied, and he's the top boy, basically, and even the headmaster, Mr. Creakle, is frightened of him and doesn't go against his wishes and the rest of it. And because of Steerforth's patronage, he manages to survive school, especially the first few days of school. So, and obviously David Copperfield worships him. He thinks he's wonderful and is so chuffed when he runs into him again after school and at the theatre. And then there's a very amusing scene where he invites Steerforth and a friend of Steerforth's to his house, and he's really proud. He's got a job, he's got an apartment, maid, and the rest of it. And they get really drunk, make complete tits of themselves by going to the theatre. And he meets Agnes, and he's just totally shamed of himself the following day. Well, yes, so that's quite amusing, and it's quite honest as well. Yeah, and realistic about stupid things that alcohol can make you do. Yeah. So Steerforth and Agnes does say at that point, don't trust your friend. He's going to lead you in a bad way. And sure enough, Steerforth does the other great crime of the novel, which is steal away a very young girl called Emily. She's poor, from the seaside in Yarmouth, from her loving guardians and family, what remains of her family, takes her abroad and just uses her as a mistress, and then she runs away. He deserts her. He won't marry her, but he offers to give her to his butler, essentially, Litimer, so she can get some sort of respectability. But we'll come back to that. So let's look at the book. Go through the story, as it were. So, yes, before he was born, his father died, and so it's just a mother and Peggotty left in the house. There's a story at the birth that Aunt Trotwood turns up as just stern and quite... what's it called? Indomitable. You really wouldn't want to mess with her kind of figure. She's really strong and tough. And when she discovers that the child is a boy, not a girl, she just loses interest and packs up. But that's kind of like the only family they've got. And we get a negative impression from Aunt Trotwood. From that, there's this, the funny scene. Well, why did they call it the rookery when there are no rooks and the rest of it? But nevertheless, the mother's got like £100 a year left to her. She's got the house left to her. It seems enough to survive, and they've got Peggotty to help them, and she would virtually work for free. Basically, she's just been there in the family for so many years, and she's part of the family. Essentially, it's a very strong relationship that he has with his nanny, I suppose, or just a house help, all through the book. Peggotty and David Copperfield's relationship is very strong and very positive. And then you've got the situation where his mother's eyes, Clara, gets turned by Mr. Murdstone, and you can see in his name it's murder and stone put together to very evocative. You just know they're not going to be nice characters. They are. So almost pantomime villains. Mr. Murdstone and his daughter, and not his daughter, his sister Jane Murdstone. They're the evil twins. Only they're not twin. Well, the brother and sister. Yeah, the evil siblings. So she gets swept off her feet, and it's very clear that from the start he's got real no love or emotion towards David Copperfield, and he dominates the mother and tries to take control of the child's education, and it's just beating David Copperfield. He's a sadist. He's just a horrible, horrible man. He's a sadist, and when David Copperfield fights back by biting him, the punishment is that he gets sent off to a school near London. So, yes, he goes to school. As I said, life is really tough, but kind of saved by Steerforth, who protects him from the bullying, which is led by the staff of the school. And Dickens is bringing out his education theme very clearly, what he thinks about this, and obviously he talks about it a couple of books later in Hard Times at detail. And it prompts Dickens to very much, yeah, here we go, to, to yep, to come forth and pretty much speak out of character, as it were, in a school carried on by sheer cruelty, whether it is presided over by a dunce or not, there is not likely to be much learnt. Yeah, yeah. It's just a machine, rather for not teaching people, just bullying people, putting them in a place, knowing how to be servile to their superiors and how to be vicious to their inferiors. You know, this is just replicating the class system without producing any great thinking about life, or any great academic achievement. It's quite horrific. And then what happens when he's at school? His mother dies. She's basically bullied to death by the Murdstones. And she has a child before she dies. And there's one telling scene where the Murdstones just can't touch the child. It's just so against their nature. They're revolted by the thought of a small child. And this is a brilliant contrast with, he's really keen to get his stick and whip David Copperfield. So he's all about inflicting pain, and he's got no problem touching a child when he's inflicting pain. But to touch a defenseless child to show love, he's just incapable of it. There's something really powerful in that. And in fact, good point to mention it, there's a lot of symbolism in this book, and I think it's brilliant because Dickens had to find other ways to reinforce his points when he couldn't just go off on one, as it were. And so he does lots of clever things. There's a thing about the changing of the paint in the house when the Murdstones arrive, and they push him, it becomes dark, and they push him to a small room, and it's horrific. And you can see another great symbolism is when he's essentially saved by his aunt, and his aunt quite deliberately renames him. I'm not going to call you David Copperfield anymore. I'm going to call you Trotwood Copperfield. This partly to fulfill that she wanted children, but it shows it is, and he does mention it. It was like, with a new name, I got a new life. There you go. And the other symbolism that I thought was pretty powerful is near the end of the book, you get Steerforth, who dies in a storm at sea, and the ship is shipwrecked on the beach, where David Copperfield fell in love with little Emily. Yeah, there's a lot of accent, dialect in this book, and that's brilliant. That's Dickens at his finest, really. And it recalls the moment when she tells him, when they're both children, I want to be a lady. I want to be a lady. He asks her, he asks her, do you want to be a lady? She says, of course. And they play and gambol and have fun. And then this is the crushing reality of it. This man, you stole her virtue and all her hopes in life by not making her a lady. And now he's washed up on the same beach that she started out life with, all these hopes and ambitions and great dreams, all completely ruined. And there he is, the man responsible for it. So I'm sure I've just picked up just a few of these quite deliberate things that Dickens puts into the novel to reinforce his point, as I said, to bring it home. So anyway, after his mum dies, the Murdstones sell all the possessions in the house, and they're going to rent it out. All the money's disappeared. It's just bloody astounding, really, isn't it? So they had £100 a year for as long as she lived, and then they got a house. So the young David Copperfield should have resources, but because of the law at that time, everything just got passed on to the husband. And that's his game. That's his game. The Murdstones, as you'll see later in the novel, he gets another wife quite quickly, and starts brutalising her, and she starts getting very ill. He's a gold digger, isn't he? Rather than being a female gold digger, he's a male gold digger. He just looks for widows that have got property that he can take off them, and then sell that property or rent it out and just live off the proceeds. What a horrible, horrible man, basically. And yeah, as he'd probably get off quite lightly in this book. Really, something horrific should have happened to them. So that situation, they just get rid of David Copperfield, which is, in this case, is going to Grimby's warehouse, because it's partly owned by Mr. Murdstone, and it's a bottling factory very close to Charles Dickens, who went to a blacking factory. So really hard manual work, physically quite damaging, I understand, long hours, and his board was paid for, and so just a tiny bit of money to have a bit of food, and so he's kind of like, he goes from one terrible situation to the next terrible situation, and it strikes me this is very much like Oliver Twist. Because Charles Dickens is brilliant when he's writing about children, and children that are basically throwing on the whims of mercy, of people's mercy. They're just it's just so sad, isn't it? And the reader's enthralled. What's this boy, who's an orphan essentially, going to do in the world? It's powerful stuff. And of course, the other book that really dwells on the emotions with this is Little Nell, of course. And yes, obviously I've talked about this before now. Maybe Dickens maybe overplayed her death and people would laugh at it, but something very compelling for readers at that time. Victorian society, a lot of them had their eyes open and knew how shitty it was for children, women, poor people, homeless people, labourers that couldn't work all year round. It was just goddamn awful. And, they had a voice in Charles Dickens. So that's the situation, and this is where, as I mentioned before, Mr. Micawber comes in with his physically ungainly and linguistically conflated and confused language to step forth to be the person who's going to supply accommodation for David Copperfield. And from the beginning, he's thrown into this bizarre adventure of them just having no money, but he's making his punch, and he's sure that something will come up. They won't take the little tiny bit of money that he has from him, that he was given to him by Peggotty. So they do show some honour. Mr. Micawber goes to debtor's prison, but David Copperfield manages to sell something from their house to pay the debt, and Mr. Micawber gets out again. But what happens is that when Mr. Micawber goes away, David Copperfield is truly left alone, and there's real uncertainty. It's a kind of crisis point for a young child. I presume he's 12, 13, 14, so young to be faced with that. Absolutely nobody there on his side to look after him, to tell him what to do. So he runs away. And he remembers what Mr. Micawber mentioned one of their previous conversations about, do you have any family, boy? Is there anybody you can appeal to for help? And he mentions his Aunt Trotwood, who he hasn't seen, but he knows where she lives. And so, the boy manages to escape London and start walking all the way to Dover, I think it is, where Aunt Trotwood lives. And just like with Oliver Twist and the rest of it, there's this these brilliant scenes. I think they're very much underplayed. Often they're just missed in the films of how a child survives doing that journey with very little money, starving and cold and the rest of it. And it talks about how he found places to hide on the evening that was safe but near people. There's some telling psychological detail all the way through this book that makes you think that this is something that Dickens probably experienced himself. There's a ring of authenticity about being homeless, about being poor, about being desperate. It runs through all of his books. that makes him important. Just a very important writer. So anyway, after I think 2 nights sleeping rough, and starving and having a funny incident where he gets given a tiny bit of money and gets some bread and stuff. Can't remember. He arrives at the Trotwoods, and yes, you see, don't forget this is a comic book. This is in still many ways a comic book. That's why I have Mr. McCorber, who's a very comic character, and you've got Aunt Trotwood, who has an obsession with donkeys. We never find out why, and she, as soon as donkeys turn up outside her house, whether she owns that land, that might be a common throwaway, but as far as she's concerned, there's no donkeys allowed across her land, and they go out with buckets of water and screaming at people on donkeys to turn back. I will not have donkeys go past my house. It's very amusing. And then you've got Mr. Dick, who lives with Aunt Trotwood, not the husband or anything. It's a distant family relative who has like sort of a little bit of money as an annuity, but I don't know the right way to put it. For Charles Dickens times, he'd just be simple, really. He has some sort of mental disability or some autism or Asperger's or something. He's clearly not suitable for the world, but there's this genius thing about whenever there's a crisis in Aunt Trotwood's life, she appeals to Mr. Dick. Mr. Dick, what should I do? And who would you ask? Who would you ask? The person who's carrying a community case? Probably not. But it's always like, I think we should give the boy a bath, because she asks him, what should we do with this child? Give him a bath. And when the Murdstones come to take him back, and then she says, what should we do? And she says, I think we should get him fitted for new clothes. Like this. It's all really practical next step stuff, but it reconfirms Aunt Trotwood in the importance of being practical and not missing the obvious. The obvious is that this is a boy, he's defenseless, and that it's a relative, and that the only humane thing to do is indeed give him a bath and some food and put him to bed, really. Yeah, there's this thing about out of the falls of babes and children or something, isn't there? I can't remember the expression, but it's something like that. It's comic, but at the same time, it's quite profound. The other bizarre comic twist to Mr. Dick's personality is that he's writing something called a memorial, which is his life's work, set in the time of Charles I. And because of his peculiarity in his mental processes, he wants to write it without mentioning the beheading of King Charles I. And he's finding this quite an impossible task, because obviously, that whole period was dominated by the only time it's happened, regicide. Well, lots of our kings have actually died, probably mostly by their own family, I suspect. But yes, very famous regicide, followed by the interregnum. It's a period in our history that is unavoidable, really, if you're writing about that period. So that's quite amusing. And as I said, that don't be fooled by all the tears that sometimes I shed. This is a really funny book. It's a really amusing book, and I have to say that I took a long time coming to make this video, because I didn't want to finish reading this book. I just enjoyed it so much, and it's the last book that I had to read by Charles Dickens anyway. So it's like you're just lingering over the final enjoyment of it. And that was only changed near the end, where I kind of felt a bit revolted by this book, but we'll get to that in due time. So, Dickens, not Dickens, there you go, I made the mistake immediately. Had schoolboy error. Copperfield has a new life, gets a new name. His aunt takes him under her wing. She repulses the Murdstones who come looking for him, and they're quite happy to get shot of him, really, as long as he doesn't cost them any money. They think they're on a winner. And she sends him to school. So he goes to a real school rather than the horrible school, Salem House. Yeah, horrible school. As is just, bullied all the time. And has a wonderful teacher in Mr. Strong. And he stays with Mr. Wickfield, who is his Aunt Agnes's solicitor, and he has a daughter called Agnes, and there's something quite moving and profound in Mr. Wickfield. I can see, yes, it's a picture of grief, essentially. So, yes, the wife dies and he's left caring for the daughter. And at the start of the novel, he seems to be, capable as a solicitor, but he's saying, I can, you've got to find the main motive of everybody, and I'm very lucky in life because my main motive is to look after my daughter, and that's sort of that gives me focus and impetus. But clearly, as the novel progresses, that's not the case, and we get this quite big revelation. Which I think is quite powerful. But for the moment, it's beautiful. He becomes a friend, like a brother to Agnes. They spend a lot of time. He makes friends at school. He has moments where he's trying to get his first girlfriend. He's leading an enjoyable, normal young person's life at school, and it's just refreshing and wonderful. He's had his big break. And then it gets to the point where he finishes school, so he has to decide upon a job. And of course, in those days, there are no jobs. This is the problem, Mr. Micawber. How do you make money? It's a total mystery in a lot of Dickens's books. So you have to buy a job, essentially. So if you're poor, you got no chance to get. When I say job, I mean something that's respectable and is going to pay you enough money to have a sort of decent life, or at least to have creditors. So she pays £1,000 or so to, as I said, Spenlow and Jorkins, to a law firm for him to join this ecclesiastical law thing. And you've got Dickens goes for a bit of satire at that point, talking about what the hell it is that they do. So this is okay. What solicitors? Okay. He is a functionary whose existence, in the natural course of things, would have terminated about 200 years ago. I can tell you best what he is by telling you what Doctors' Commons is. It's a little out-of-the-way place where they administer what is called ecclesiastical law and play all kinds of tricks with obsolete old monsters of Acts of Parliament, which 3/4 of the world know nothing about, and the other fourth supposes to have been dug up in a fossil state in the days of the early Edwards. It's a place that has an ancient monopoly in suits about people's wills and people's marriages, and disputes among ships and boats. Yeah, so Dickens has got Steerforth, this cynical cad, we find out later, to, in a very offhand way, to explain to the reader what Dickens thinks about the ecclesiastical courts, commons courts. It's just hangover from medieval times where, yes, they get this just by getting this monopoly on wills and marriages and boats. And funny enough, the book contains all three, really. So that's curious. So, and he just wants to please his aunt, doesn't he? And he sees that that's an option, so I'll go for it. But yeah, he kind of soon discovers that, these Spenlow and Jorkins, they don't seem to take it very seriously, that things progress very slowly. It's pretty dull work altogether. But he's very happy. He's become a young man of means, and he meets Steerforth, and he gets his own apartment. He's set up by his aunt, and everything's looking pretty good for David Copperfield. And then he falls in love with his boss's, Mr. Spenlow's, daughter, Dora. She's adorable. She's Dora. She plays the piano. She has a horrible little dog called Jip, and the little Jip is basically telling the reader quite straight away, this is a spoilt girl, and she's spoilt this dog, and this dog behaves awfully to everybody apart from her. It's quite hard to like her in the beginning, and then He meets Treadles again from his first school, Salem House. They become friends. Treadles is really struggling to break into law as well, but he hasn't had the advantage of a rich aunt. And then we're set up with this situation, basically. It becomes like, who's David Copperfield going to marry? Obviously, he fancies Dora, but first of all, he declared his love for Emily. And then from his school days, we've got Agnes, who's this really wise girl who grows up with, who's confident, and he loves to see her and hang out with her and the rest of it. They seem to share so many values in life. Who's he going to go for? Who's he going to go for? And then because it's all told from David Copperfield's point of view, I think some of the other characters, especially his Aunt Trotwood, knows clearly who he should choose, but don't want to interfere. So I don't know. It becomes a bit like a Jane Austen book in this way. It's all about marriage at this point. So who's he going to? I hope this is working. Who's he going to marry? Well, early on, he takes Steerforth for a weekend to Yarmouth to see his friends, the Peggottys, because he went there on a summer holiday, and he met them all, very interesting characters. There's Ham, and there's the old Peggotty, and Mrs. Gummidge, who's Mr. Peggotty just looks after, and even though they're no relations, and then there's a sort of his cousin that he sort of adopts as his daughter, little Emily. She's beautiful and young and very much the spirit of the place, and so the children play together, and it looks like that's been set up. But what happens when David Copperfield introduces Steerforth to these people is that he seems to be a friend, and he becomes very interested in boats and learning about boats. But he's got this butler with him, Mr. Littimer, who's kind of a fixer and a bit mysterious. And before you know it, he's basically eloped with Emily, who was meant to marry Ham, who is considerably older than her. So that's already kind of going into the thing that I find quite hard to deal with in this book. It's kind of like he does ask her and she does say yes, but there's a sense of like she's being trapped by this, and she has sort of like, familiar feelings for Ham, but probably not romantic feelings for this big hulking fisherman. And wishing to be a lady, she's conned a little bit, and she runs away with Steerforth onto the continent. And this is it's devastating for Peggotty, the old sailor. And he goes off to find her and dedicates his life to searching Europe and London and the country to find her and bring her back, because he sees there's no shame in whatever she's done. He just wants her back. This is, as I said, this is an example of a really strong relationship where it doesn't matter what you do, I'm going to forgive you. Just live with me and you'll be all right. It's a really beautiful, strong relationship. You can compare this with obviously the false relationship that Emily has with Steerforth. She was expecting far more than he was willing to give, and he was teasing her with this at the beginning in order to acquire her virginity, essentially. What boys will promise to girls before they get their way. So that's Emily out the question. And then when Agnes sees that David Copperfield set on getting Dora, she steps back and she won't say anything bad about Dora, and she takes more of a sisterly role, and because she's very polite like Aunt Trotwood, she doesn't say anything bad about Dora, but it's clear that both of them see that she isn't the one for him at all. She might be beautiful, but she's totally superficial, but there seems to be this disparity. He can't marry her because Mr. Spenlow, he's like Mr. Wickfield. He's a widow looking after daughter, and he's the boss. And they live in a much nicer house than David Copperfield, who just rents a couple of rooms. And there seems to be a big financial gap between them. However, he dies, and declaring that he had a will and everything set up for his daughter, but that wasn't the case. It's just a complete lie. It's a fabrication. It's a pretense, just like the law. I think Dickens is saying, these people's words, can't back it up. And also this thing about what happens to the child without a will, and all the debts and stuff. So everything was sold. She's got no money. She's forced to live with her aunts. Now she's poor. All the irony is, I can't marry her because she's too rich. She's well above my station. It turns out that she's probably below your station, David Copperfield. So he goes to the aunts. He slowly builds up a relationship with them, and yes, he's allowed to eventually marry Dora. So yeah, this should be the start of matrimonial bliss, but yeah, quite early on, it just gets like, I just did not like reading this at all. She's childish. She's completely spoiled. She's incapable of learning anything to do with basic bookkeeping or looking after the house. They employ servants who just steal from them. She gets upset when he's busy writing or studying, trying to make a living for them. And she even wants to be referred to as a child wife. She wants to be petted like a dog, and she's infantilized. Just like in Edwin Drood, the heroine in that, who, she's just treated like a child and encouraged to behave like that. It's just like just regressing, and it's just awful. Is that what a Victorian man wants? It's just awful. And there's a point later on where he meets Traddles, and Traddles eventually gets his dream marriage, and it does seem to be that's the Victorian ideal woman, which is quite upsetting for me. I thought, oh dearie dear, you could do better than that. I can't find it at the moment, but yeah, there's the bit where Traddles, says, oh, she's really good around the house. She's good at cooking, and the rest of it, and. Yeah, what a lucky man you are. You've got a perfect wife. I was thinking, no, this is just terrible. Oh. And then you've got the situation of Mr. Strong, who's the teacher, who's a very positive character, and he marries one of his students who must be, half his age, essentially. And there's this thing about she might have been having an affair with a handsome young cousin, but turned out to be not true at all. But this is all just like, Dickens just let this go. It doesn't see any need to point anything out about this. It seems to be nothing wrong, in his opinion, about these couplings where you've got poverty and youth against age and riches, and that seems to be fine. It's the way of the world, and it's like, I'm not so sure about that. And the way that what an ideal wife is, I didn't feel very comfortable with all of this at all. And then the Emily thing is interesting. It's because she's been sullied, she can't really be part of the story again. She becomes very marginalised. We see her a little bit at the end when she's very ill, when she comes back to London after escaping Steerforth, and she becomes a prostitute. She's just not suitable almost for this sort of middle-class readership. He doesn't want to dwell on her, and also he doesn't really want to dwell on Dora's death as well, So he kind of like goes a little bit between the two, and he, also with the thing about Uriah Heep at the same time. He pulls a sort of quite a clever novelistic trick that it doesn't become a great moment of pathos when Dora dies, and Emily is kind of shuffled off the stage very conveniently to Australia with Micawber. And so, yes, then you have this comment about colonialism, about how there's actually jobs out there. My God, there's jobs, real jobs. And indeed, Micawber eventually becomes a magistrate in Australia. It's the land of possibilities. It's the motherland sending out people to find a place to colonize, essentially, because there's no opportunities in London for them, and there's a new start for Emily where she will be forgiven her fallen nature. It's a terrible moralistic Victorian society. As I said, it's only Mr. Peggotty really who was unashamed in saying, no, I don't believe she's done anything wrong, I just don't care. But for the novelist, she had to be quickly shuffled off the stage. So that only leaves one person, doesn't it? Agnes. And when David Copperfield first mentions that he's going to marry Dora to his aunt, she goes blind, 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 and that's all she says. But that's quite very prophetic. And she's known all along, and he goes off. So he has success, becomes a writer. First of all, he learns how to do shorthand, and he takes down speeches that are made in Parliament, but he slowly is working on a book, and he gains some fame from that. Dora dies. He's shocked, he's grieved, and he goes off to the continent to think about it. And when he comes back, he only needs a little prod from Aunt Trot to make him realise that, yes, he chose the wrong woman all along. He should have married Agnes, because they just have so much in common. They're about the same age, the same education, the same mind and purpose. I'll come back to that when I read some of the quotes. But it's very clear this is one of the key themes in the novel: suitability in marriage. You got it wrong first time, but he gets it right the second time. I suppose, like Dickens, of course, Dickens doesn't really remarry. And then, yes, to the uncomfortableness of it. What really happened to Dickens' wife is that she gave him 10 children. Dora doesn't give him any children in this book. Whereas Agnes gives him 5, but Dora doesn't give him any. And then I think she just doesn't want to go out, doesn't want to, be the man about town. I think it's his mother with 10 children. She's just exhausted. I think she's put on a bit of what we would call real estate nowadays. And he tries to get rid of her first by sending her trying to get her committed to a sanatorium, and then coming up with an agreement to separate, obviously to pay her off, and then to go to a much younger woman. Yes, Charles Dickens, for all his brilliant pleading for the disenfranchised and the poor, he does in his own life let himself down somewhat. All right, so that's the story. Yes, I would say I find it very powerful. The death of his mother. Just a simple sentence. So I lost her. And then we stand around the grave. The day seems different to me from every other day, and from the light not of the same colour, of a sadder colour. Now there is a solemn hush, which we have brought from home with what is resting in the mould. And while we stand bareheaded, I hear the voice of the clergyman, sounding remote in an open air, and yet distinct and plain, saying, I am the resurrection and the life, saith the Lord. Then I hear sobs, and standing apart among the lookers on, I see that good and faithful servant, whom of all the people upon earth I love the best, and unto whom my childish heart is certain that the Lord will one day say, well done. It's written in first person. It's not first person. It's written in the present tense. So, this is genius. I think it's called historical present, to give it a technical term. So on a very few occasions, he goes from the past tense into the present tense. It makes it more immediate, impactful, and it's like this imaginary author who's telling his own story. He's there. He's reliving it. Yes, makes it very powerful, in my opinion. Yes, more heartbreak, really. So this is one of the points where Dickens comes through clearly. He's not David Copperfield anymore, and he's talking about his time in the factory. So he's saying, I've never told anybody about this before because I'm so ashamed of it. No one has ever raised that curtain since. I have lifted it for a moment, even in this narrative, with a reluctant hand, and dropped it gladly. The remembrance of that life is fraught with so much pain to me, with so much mental suffering and want of hope, that I have never had the courage even to examine how long I was doomed to lead it. Whether it lasted for a year or more or less, I do not know. Only know that it was and ceased to be, and that I have written, and there I leave it. Yeah, it's just like he's forced himself to forget about this time when he was working as a child in a factory, and I don't blame him. You would do. It's it's a way of survival to try and expunge these awful experiences from your life. Like, like if you're a rape victim or something like that, you just want to try and put it behind you and not try and dwell on the point. Oh yes, and there's this thing. I just like so social satire. So Steerforth talking about, yeah, poor people, and this is probably quite a prevalent attitude, and hasn't really. I'm not sure if it's there's still a certain amount of it around today. There's a pretty wide separation between them and us, said Steerforth with indifference. They are not to be expected to be as sensitive as we are. Their delicacy is not to be shocked or hurt very easily. They are wonderfully virtuous, I dare say. Some people contend for that. At least, I am sure I don't want to contradict them. But they have very fine. But they do not have very fine natures, and they may be thankful that, like their coarse, rough skins, they are not easily wounded. So Steerforth considers the working class to be no different to animals of labour. Essentially, you can't harm them so much. Oh, they're tough, I'm sure they're very fine in their own way, but yeah. So it just gives him carte blanche to abuse this poor girl and to deceive this whole community and this whole family, and in horrific way he does, that leads to her being a prostitute. My God, how to absolve yourself of all sins like that, but just making your victim less than human. It's just terrific. I don't want to go through all of these, but oh yes, then there's this thing about there's a disabled character in this book, Mrs. Mocher, who's tiny basically, and she does tricks and flicks for the rich, cuts their hair and witty in front of them in order to get a few pennies and to survive. And obviously she's tiny and just ignored and laughed at by society. And she upbraids David Copperfield at one point, and she says, "Try not to associate bodily defects with mental, my good friend, except for solid reason. Just because I'm tiny doesn't mean I'm stupid." I love that. And yes, he does. He lets these figures, he gives them their own words to fight back, and I love that. Let's go straight to its selfishness was inseparable from Dora. There you go. Yeah, she was just selfish, basically, and he's sort of owning up to it. But that's his excuse for getting over her death quite quickly and marrying Agnes. And there's there was a speech by Agnes, because Uriah Heep's he's the evil character. He's managed to wheedle his way into their house from being basically some sort of copywriter for Mr. Wickfield to being his partner in business, because he's just degenerating all the time through drink and not paying attention, and Uriah is actually just cheating him to the stage where he's got half the business, and he intends to even marry Agnes, and has the temerity to actually mention that at the dinner table to everybody's surprise. So this is what Agnes says when she's forced to live with Uriah and lechery and the rest of it. The chief evil of their presence is in the house, said Agnes, is that I cannot be as near papa as I could wish. Uriah Heep being so much between us, and cannot watch over him, if that is not too bold a thing to say, as closely as I would. But if any fraud or treachery is practised against him, I hope that simple love and truth will be stronger in the end. I hope that real love and truth are stronger in the end than any evil or misfortune in the world. And I think that that could be the MO of basically a lot of Dickens' thinkings altogether. He wants to have the happy ending, and he wants to show that love and truth are stronger than evil and misfortune. This retells this. This is a story retold and retold again in Dickens. He wants to give people hope. He wants to make them laugh. Wants to make them cry, but wants to take hope away. So she's brilliant in formulating. In a way, Agnes is his muse, is Dickens's muse. I feel he is his perfect woman, isn't it? And why is it his perfect woman? Because it's pointed out in, I think, one of the best quotes in Dickens. If I can find it. Oh yes, there's a self-realization. Keep my finger on that. There can be no disparity in marriage like unsuitability of mind and purpose. There you go. There can be no disparity in marriage like unsuitability of mind and purpose. Yes, so it's very clear. This is the lesson. Victorian novels love giving you lessons, and this is the one. You've got to marry somebody who has the same mind and the same purpose as you. And this is Mr. Strong that says this, really, and it strikes home for David Copperfield that this is where he was been going wrong all the years, and probably true for Charles Dickens in a way. He made a mistake with his first marriage. He realised that they weren't united in mind and purpose. That's his excuse, probably not for just not fancying his wife anymore. And then, okay, finally, or near the end, there's this Mr. Wickfield. So as I said, he's drinking himself to death while looking after his daughter, and he imagines that he's doing the right thing because he's devoting his life to his daughter and grieving his wife's death. And then we have this outpouring. It's almost like Dostoevsky in a way, where he kind of like comes to a massive realization in his life about just where he'd gone wrong all the time. Okay. What I have come down to be since I first saw you in this house. I was on my downward way then, but the dreary, dreary road I have traversed since. Weak indulgence has ruined me, indulgence in remembrance, and indulgence in forgetfulness. My natural grief for my child's mother turned to disease. My natural love for my child turned to disease. I have infected everything I touched. I have brought misery on what I dearly love. I know you know. I thought it possible that I could truly love one creature in the world and not love the rest. I thought it possible that I could truly mourn for one creature gone out of the world and not have some part in the grief of all who mourned. Thus the lessons of my life have been perverted. I have preyed on my own morbid, coward heart, and it has preyed on me. Sordid in my grief, sordid in my love, sordid in my miserable escape from the darker side of both. Oh, see the ruin I am, and hate me, shun me. Really powerful stuff. Charles Dickens, at his finest, a novelist with just great perspicuity, understanding of human nature and how things can go wrong. It's a funny book. I love it. Absolutely love this book. And I'm partly crying because that's the end. I've just got some notes about travelling around Italy. I've bought a book. I might do that one next. Oh, God, I have to reread Bleak House for the third time. Perhaps. I don't know. But yes, it's been wonderful so far. And I recommend this one. Yeah, I reckon this should be one of the first ones you read, really, to understand about where Dickens is coming from. It's easy to read because it's easy to follow. There's not millions of different stories and characters going off in all directions. It's, as I say, it's a very tightly constructed, well-constructed book. Oh, by the way, Uriah ends up in prison with Litimer for committing fraud against the Bank of England, and he's pretending to be a model member of the prison, and Mr. Creakle is the governor of the prison, who's easily fooled by Uriah's I'm being humble, I'm being humble, yeah. So there's delightful ending in that way. And of course Steerforth dies, as I said, and Agnes and David Copperfield marry. They have 5 children. Wow. See, he had 10 children in real life, and they call one of the children Dora, which is, yes, I find that a good way to dealing with the past. So, thank you very much. That's it.